start today with a little mental experiment. If you can, I want you to close your eyes for just a second. Seriously, humor me.
Okay, I'm playing along.
When I say the words founding father, who is the very first person that pops into your head?
I mean, it's the standard lineup, isn't it? I'm picturing a guy on a dollar bill. George Washington, probably?
Exactly. We all see the same thing. Washington, Thomas Jefferson, maybe Ben Franklin if you're feeling a bit scientific. But
Yeah.
generally, it's a guy in a powdered wig holding a quill pen, standing in a stuffy room in Philadelphia in 1776.
That's the image. That's the first founding. It's what we get from textbooks, from statues, from currency. It's the brand.
Right. But today, we're going to look at a stack of sources that basically want to take that mental image and just shatter it. We're diving into a really provocative argument that suggests the first founding of 1776 was actually, well, the sources use a pretty harsh word, defective.
And it's not just calling it bad or, outdated. It's a legal argument.
The whole thesis here is that the United States didn't actually become a functioning democracy until much, much later during a second founding.
And the sources argue that the true architect of this second founding wasn't a wealthy landowner in a wig.
It was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And we need to be clear right off the bat. This isn't just saying MLK was a great guy or MLK was a hero. The argument is much more literal than that. It's claiming that King and his contemporaries did the actual literal work of a founding father. They took the theoretical rhetoric of the nation, which was basically just pretty words, and forced it to become an operational reality. They built the structure we actually live in.
So let's unpack this. Because if we're going to call MLK a founder, we first have to understand why the first guys, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, essentially failed the inspection. Why was the house they built defective?
To understand that, the source material leans really heavily on a critique from Justice Thurgood Marshall.
The Supreme Court Justice.
The very same. Back in 1987, the country was gearing up for the bicentennial of the Constitution. Big parties, fireworks, everyone patting themselves on the back.
And Marshall wasn't having it.
Not at all. He refused to join the celebration.
That's a pretty bold move for a sitting Supreme Court justice.
It was. But his argument was that the government devised in 1787 was, and this is his quote, defective from the start. He pointed out the obvious. The "we the people" in the preamble, it explicitly excluded the majority of the population.
Right. Black people, obviously.
Exactly. Marshall's argument, and the argument of the thesis we're exploring today, is that the credit for the Constitution's survival doesn't belong to the guys who wrote it.
It belongs to the people who were excluded.
Yes, the people who refused to accept its exclusions, people who forced the document to expand.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. We hear this all the time. They were men of their time, right? Can we really call the whole founding defective just because they had the prejudices of the 18th century?
See, that's where the sources get really specific. They argue that this wasn't just about personal prejudice, it was about infrastructure. The argument is that the founders built a specific legal machine designed to protect a racial hierarchy, a machine with 3 specific gears. The sources highlight 3 clauses in the Constitution that protected slavery, even though, and this is the tricky part, they never actually used the word slave.
Strategic ambiguity.
Precisely. So let's look at the first gear, Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 compromise.
It counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of people, myself included, vaguely remember this as being insulting, but maybe, I don't know, a weird attempt to say, well, they're at least part human.
That is the most common misconception, and the sources say it's actually dangerous, because that clause had absolutely nothing to do with the humanity of the enslaved person.
It was about math.
Purely political math. The South wanted to count their enslaved population, not to give them rights or a vote or citizenship, but to boost the number of bodies so the South could get more seats in the House of Representatives.
And more votes in the Electoral College.
Exactly. It was about power.
So it was about inflating the power of the slaveholder.
Correct. The North said, no, if you treat them as property, you don't get to count them for votes. The 3/5 was the deal they cut. It rewarded the South for holding people in bondage by giving them more control over the federal government.
So that's the first gear, rigging the voting power.
Right. The second gear is Article 1, Section 9, the Slave Trade Clause. It prohibited Congress from banning the importation of such persons for 20 years, until 1808.
So essentially, a 20-year grace period for human trafficking.
Constitutionally protected kidnapping. And then the third gear, and the sources argue this is the one that really nationalized the system, is the Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2.
That's the one about runaways.
It said that if a person held to service or labor escaped to a free state, they had to be delivered up.
Delivered up. That sounds ominous.
Think about what that actually means. It meant that even if you lived in a state that abolished slavery, say Pennsylvania, you were legally deputized as an enforcer for a slaveholder in Georgia.
So there was no such thing as a free state?
Not really, because the federal contract required complicity from everyone.
So when you look at those three things together, the inflated voting power, the trafficking protection, and the national enforcement, it's hard to argue it was just an oversight. It looks like a feature, not a bug.
It was contract protecting an economic system. And that brings us to the core group of people discussed in these documents, the people who were that economic system, the foundational Black Americans.
Yeah, I saw that term FBA all over the source material. We should probably define that because it seems distinct from just saying Black Americans or African Americans.
It is. It's a very specific lineage distinction. Foundational Black Americans refers to the direct descendants of the freedmen, the formerly enslaved people who were here during the formative years of the nation.
So this distinguishes that group from, say, a Black immigrant who moved here from Nigeria in 1990.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes this isn't about social exclusion. It's about what they call an equity stake.
Equity stake, like in a company.
Think of the United States as a startup. There are the founders who put in the sweat equity when the company is worth zero, right? They build the product, they build the office. Then there are employees who get hired 200 years later once the company is a global giant. Mm. The argument is that the FBA lineage was the economy during the nation's startup phase.
The blood and sweat equity.
Literally. The sources point out that the physical infrastructure of Washington, D.C., the White House, the Capitol, the very symbols of our democracy, were built by enslaved labor. But beyond the buildings, look at the exports. By the mid-19th century, cotton accounted for something like 50, maybe 60% of all U.S. exports.
That is a massive number. I don't think I realized it was that high.
It was the oil of the 19th century. The entire global position of the United States, its banking system, its shipping industry, its credit, was financed by that labor. So the FBA thesis is simple. You don't just live in a house you built. You have an ownership claim to it.
There's a comparison in the notes that I found really interesting and honestly a little heartbreaking. It contrasts the FBA experience with the traditional immigrant success story, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative.
Right, we love that story. But MLK himself rejected that comparison for this specific lineage. He called it a cruel jest. He pointed out that while FBA ancestors were enslaved, the U.S. government was giving away millions of acres of land to European immigrants through the Homestead Acts.
So one group got free land capital, and the other group was being used as capital.
Precisely. King's argument was that you can't tell a man to lift himself by his bootstraps when he's barefoot because you stole his boots.
So if the first founding was defective and the FBA lineage built the economic engine, how do we get to King as the architect?
This is where we have to pivot to the second founding. Because usually when we think of MLK, we think of the dream. We think of a moral plea for everyone to be nice to each other.
And the sources say that is a sanitized, watered-down version of history. They argue that the 1963 March on Washington wasn't a request for kindness.
It was a contract dispute. King used the metaphor of the promissory note. He said the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were a check signed by the architects of the Republic, a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
But for Black Americans,
the check came back marked insufficient funds.
I love that metaphor because it completely flips the power dynamic. If I'm holding a bad check that you wrote, I'm not asking you for charity.
I'm a creditor. You owe me. King positioned the FBA community not as outsiders begging to get into the club, but as the true owners of the principles the nation claimed to hold. He's saying, we aren't trying to destroy the Constitution, we are trying to cash it.
And the sources point to his letter from Birmingham jail as essentially the Declaration of Independence for this second founding.
It's where he asserts primacy. He writes, before the pen of Jefferson scratched across the pages of history, we were here. He's saying that the FBA lineage carried the torch of American ideals through the darkness of slavery, even when the so-called first founders were too compromised to carry it themselves.
So, by enduring the oppression, they earned the moral authority to lead the nation.
Yes. And King warned that if the nation didn't listen, if it didn't shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, it was doomed to destruction.
But here's where I want to dig deeper, because the Dream speech is famous, but the source material dives into a part of King's legacy that I feel like gets totally erased from the history books.
His economic policy.
Exactly.
This is crucial. If you view King as a founder, you have to look at his blueprint for the country. And it wasn't just about sitting at lunch counters.
No, the sources mention a specific legislative package he was working on, the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged.
Think of it as his version of the GI Bill, but for the people who had been locked out of the American dream.
So what was actually in it? Because I feel like if we knew this, it would change how we see him.
It was radical, especially for the time. First, he called for guaranteed jobs, a federal commitment to full employment. If the private sector couldn't hire you, the government would. Second, and this is something we talk about today like it's a new idea from Silicon Valley, he called for a guaranteed income.
Like universal basic income, UBI.
Basically, yes. King looked at the economy and saw automation coming. He realized that market fluctuations would always hurt the poorest people first. So he argued that survival should be decoupled from the market.
A floor beneath you just for being a citizen.
That's it. And third, he wanted massive investment in housing and education to close the generational gap. He famously said, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?"
He was trying to settle the account.
And he based this on the concept of unpaid wages. This wasn't welfare in his mind, it was restitution. He argued based on common law. If you appropriate the labor of another human being for centuries, you owe them back pay.
He said, no amount of gold could provide an adequate compensation, yet a price can be placed on unpaid wages.
And the grim reality, the sources point out, is that he was assassinated while planning the Poor People's Campaign, which was a march specifically designed to go to Washington and collect that check.
And looking at the data today, the wealth gap between black and white families, it seems like the check is still uncashed.
The gap hasn't just persisted. In many metrics, it has widened. The economic restitution King called for, the capitalization of the second founding, it never happened.
Now, obviously, MLK is the protagonist of this narrative, but the source material makes it clear he didn't do it alone. Just as Washington had Hamilton and Adams, King had a kind of founding team.
Right. You can't talk about the second founding without Frederick Douglass. The sources call him the intellectual founder.
Douglass is fascinating because he didn't always believe in the Constitution, right?
No, as a young man, he agreed with the radical abolitionists. He thought the Constitution was a pact with the devil and should be burned.
But he changed his mind.
He evolved. He realized that the text itself, because of that strategic ambiguity we talked about earlier, never actually said slave.
So he saw a loophole.
He saw a weapon. He argued that if you took the text literally and ignored the racist intent of the guys who wrote it, it was actually an anti-slavery document. He laid the intellectual groundwork for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
He essentially stole the enemy's weapon and used it against them.
Then you have Harriet Tubman. The sources call her the warrior founder. And honestly, her resume is insane. I feel like we learn about her as a sweet old lady who helped people hide in barns.
Which is a complete disservice to who she was.
A total disservice. She was a spy and a general. The source highlights the Combahee River raid. Tubman led 150 Union soldiers into South Carolina. She guided the steamboats through Confederate mines because she knew the river. She was the first woman to lead an armed military raid in U.S. history. She liberated over 700 enslaved people and burned down plantations. That is a founder's act, physically breaking the chains and crippling the enemy's economy to preserve the Union.
And finally, we have the jurist founder, Thurgood Marshall.
Marshall is the closer. He took Douglass's theories and Tubman's activism and codified them into law. By winning Brown v. Board, he dismantled the legal framework of segregation. He validated the 14th Amendment.
He turned equal protection from a phrase on paper into a legal reality.
He made it real.
And there was one more name mentioned, Henry Highland Garnet. I wasn't as familiar with him.
Garnet represents the radical voice. In 1865, right after the 13th Amendment passed, He became the first black man to speak in the House of Representatives. His sermon was titled, "Let the Monster Perish." He was there to celebrate the death of slavery and set the agenda. Emancipation must be followed by the vote.
When you look at this lineup, King, Douglas, Tubman, Marshall, Garnett, you see a group of people who didn't just reform the country, they rebuilt it.
That is the key distinction, the difference between a reformer and a founder. A reformer asks for inclusion in the existing house. A founder asserts ownership of the house and redesigns the foundation.
The argument is that the first founding created a theoretical democracy, a nice idea on paper, but structurally unsound.
But the second founding, paid for in the blood and sweat of the FBA lineage, created the operational democracy we actually live in today.
And that operational democracy was expensive, it cost lives, it cost labor. And the argument concludes that the debt for that construction, the unpaid wages King talked about, has never been paid.
It really makes you rethink the way we teach history. We usually treat Black history as this separate struggle for civil rights, distinct from the creation of the nation.
But this perspective says no, the struggle for rights was the creation of the nation.
Precisely. The first founders defaulted on their own contract.
Yeah.
The FBA lineage picked it up, honored it, and validated it.
So we've unpacked the legal defects of 1776, defined the specific FBA lineage and their economic contribution, looked at MLK's specific demands for restitution, and met the team that built the second founding. It leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on.
It does. If we accept this thesis, that MLK and the FBA lineage are the true architects of the modern United States, then the question isn't just about equality in a social sense, it's about settlement.
Settlement of the account.
Right. If you build a house and someone else lives in it and claims they built it, and then they finally let you in the front door after 200 years, do they just get to say, welcome home?
Or do they owe you back wages for the construction and the rent for the years you were locked out?
That is the thought we want to leave you with today. We often ask what the nation owes its citizens in terms of protection or liberty, but what does the nation owe its founders?
And if the check is still marked insufficient funds, can we really say the founding is finished? Or are we still in the middle of it?
Something to mull over.
Thanks for diving deep